Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I wanted to tell you about our new program. We've joined up with the Great Courses to tell you about the Great Courses Plus, their program of a streaming service of their courses and lectures. And this is founded on the idea that education should be accessible to everyone, which, as you know, I definitely believe. And they make it possible to learn from the brightest minds out there that most of us would otherwise not have access to. Professors from the best universities in the world, like Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. Excerpts from National Geographic and the Smithsonian. So these are college-level learning courses. You can access both the entire course or just individual lectures from hundreds of courses. And looks like this. Just have it on your phone. There's the little app right there. I just punch the app and the different courses pop up. You can see there's just literally dozens and dozens just on the first page here that you can access to. And you just punch the course and it accesses all the different lectures, and you just touch the screen for the one you want to listen to. You can listen to it at normal speed or like I do it, 1.25 speed. So 30-minute lecture ends up being about 25 minutes. And so here's the deal. They're offering my listeners this 3 months of unlimited access for just $30. That's only $10 per month. That's what, two and a half venti lattes at Starbucks for an entire month. I spend that much in coffee every day. So it's a good deal. It's a great learning experience. It's a great way to spend time when you're driving, hiking, walking, doing chores, basically multitasking, and you get to consume content. So that's the deal. 3 months of unlimited access for the Great Courses Plus for just $30, $10 a month. To get the details, go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. This is my pleasure.
Yeah, no, this is a fabulous book. The book, just to introduce it to our listeners, Not Born Yesterday. The Science of Who We Trust and What We Believe. So this, I have to say, I don't say this about many of the books that I discuss here, is one of the most important I've ever read in terms of what I do for a living, which is my day job is publishing Skeptic Magazine. And so here's the paradox and the dive into your book. For 27 years, we've been publishing stuff about gullibility, basically, all the crazy things people believe, astrology and tarot cards and psychics and all the paranormal bunkum and supernatural religious beliefs and, climate denial and vaccine denial and evolution denial and Holocaust denial and so on and so forth. So if we're not gullible, as you seem to argue, then what have I been doing for 27 years? But then paradoxically, why would I bother to publish a magazine debunking all these claims without the hope that people will absorb the material and go, yeah, that's bullshit, so I'm not going to believe this anymore? Obviously, I must think that I can change people's minds or I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. So I think that's a good dive into your book, which is to say, obviously, we have some gullibility, but we're not completely gullible. What's the balance there? And give us a little background about how you kind of came at this problem.
So, well, thank you for the introduction. And it was kind of funny to me because I don't have a hard copy yet, so I was kind of jealous of.
There it is. Yeah, no, it's beautiful.
It's the first time. It's not the first time.
It's a really nice design, with the red, yellow, and green. We're good to go.
Yeah. Well, thanks. So the way I came into this was through work that Dan Sperber and a bunch of colleagues. So Dan Sperber was my PhD advisor and did on what he called epistemic vigilance and what I call in the book open vigilance, but it's probably the same concept, which is a set of cognitive mechanisms that we use to evaluate what people tell us. And the idea is that evolutionarily, it wouldn't be quite plausible that humans would be gullible because essentially, if our ancestors had been gullible, they would have been easily manipulated by others, and they would not have made it so far. So evolutionarily, the prediction is that people should be quite conservative and quite vigilant and quite good at evaluating what people tell them.
Right. So, like the latest issue of Skeptic, I have Steve Pinker on the cover, and the cover story is "We are not living in a post-truth world." And this is in response to Lee McIntyre's book, which is called Post-Truth. And then he wrote a rebuttal to Steve's article saying, we are living in a post-truth world. and the argument I think really depends on how you define post-truth. Steve, in a way, is arguing that there's nothing new about the Trump era of spin doctoring facts and exaggerating things and even lying. Maybe Trump does it a bit more than previous politicians. But there's nothing new to that. And also what's debatable is to what extent people actually believe the lies of the Trump administration more than maybe they believe those of the Bush administration or Obama or anybody, really. And so it kind of comes down to really how do you define post-truth in the sense of how gullible are we really to fall for political rhetoric like this versus it's really an ancient problem that we've always pushed back against.
So it is indeed an ancient problem, and indeed, the Greeks are well known for warning us against the dangers of demagogues, which I think were exaggerated back in the day and are still exaggerated. In that most of the lies we do believe are lies that we believe because they fit with our pre-existing views. So it's not as if Trump was able, or anybody else really was able, to completely change people's minds through kind of crafty manipulation and lies. Instead, what he does, and what populists do more generally, is tell things that people want to hear and that other politicians weren't necessarily saying before because it might have been politically incorrect or no one figured out that's what people wanted to hear. So it's not as if there was kind of really widespread manipulation going on. So there might be widespread lying, but that lying might just be, then again, reinforcing people's prejudices rather than changing them.
Right. I think this is the key sentence in your opening chapter in which you define these, what you call open vigilance mechanisms that I want to talk about a little bit. Quote, these mechanisms allow us to accept most beneficial messages, to be open, while rejecting most harmful messages, to be vigilant. So I gather there you're arguing that there's some balance between being open. This is the way skeptics like to say it. You want to be open-minded enough to accept radical new ideas that are true, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out and you believe every wacky idea that comes down the pike.
Yes, and it is indeed a hard balance to reach. The idea is that so by default, I think we're more vigilant. So our default reaction is we're only going to accept things that fit with our prior beliefs. And in order to overcome that initial kind of conservativeness or pig-headedness, even if you will, we look for a number of cues. So we look at whether the person is competent, whether they are the right expertise, whether they have our interests at heart, whether they have good arguments. And as these cues pile up, then we might end up changing our minds.
Yeah, I think of some of these classic social psych experiments where like smoke comes into a room and everybody sitting at a table is a shill except for the one subject, and they're all filling out forms. We actually did a replication of this for NBC a few years ago. And I was always troubled by these experiments because, of course, the one subject is looking around the room and everybody keeps filling out the form while smoke is coming into the room. And he goes, well, all right, and then keeps filling out the form. And then everybody laughs about it like, yeah, people are so gullible. But really, if it was a real fire in a real room, people wouldn't just be sitting there filling out forms. They'd jump up and then you'd go, okay. So in that sense, we look to others for cues, and there's really good evolutionary reasons why we should do that. Not that we're gullible, but because those are sources of good information.
Indeed. So we know from political science, from the Condorcet-Jury theorem and other mathematical or empirical demonstrations that as a rule, following the majority is an extremely good heuristic. So as long as people are just even a little bit more likely than chance to get it right on their own, then following what the majority thinks is a very, very good heuristic. And indeed, we see it all across the animal kingdom. Any kind of animal that lives in group is going to follow that heuristic in one way or another, and humans are no different. Indeed, if we have an issue, it's more with ignoring, like putting not enough weight on what the majority thinks or does, rather than too much.
Right, and the same thing with children who look to their parents as authorities for reliable information. Of course, people like Richard Dawkins worry that they're contaminating children with religious viruses, as he famously makes this argument, and that's a good argument. But really, most of the information that children get from their parents is probably pretty good. So that's not a, in other words,
Yes.
it's not a bug, it's a feature.
It is, indeed. It makes complete sense that that children should look up to people who are vastly more knowledgeable, and anybody who has children, I think, will accept that. The main problem isn't that they're too gullible, but that it's too hard to change their minds. It's too hard to stop them, beating their brothers, to stop them, to make them eat broccoli, to make them go to bed early. Really influencing them is the problem, not that they're too easily influenced.
So here's the problem you're trying to explain as I got it from your book. Quote, why some ideas, including good ones, are so hard to get across, while others, including bad ones, are so popular. So that gets to where I started.
Mm-hmm.
You opened your book with your own personal story of how you got hoodwinked for whatever it was, €20 or something.
Anyways, yeah.
So why did you fall for that obvious simple scam, and why does anybody do that?
So I guess because we're living in such a complex environment, we have to use heuristics in order to judge other people. We're constantly dealing with people we've never met before, people about whom we have little information, and so we have to go by appearances, by credentials, by kind of more superficial cues rather than deep arguments. And on the whole, these cues work well, but there are exceptions. So, for instance, most people sort of trust science. I mean, it's one of the few institutions that remain mostly trusted these days, and that's great. And on the whole, it's obviously a good thing. And if people didn't trust science at all, they wouldn't believe in evolution at all, they wouldn't believe in climate change at all. But obviously, because they trust science, it also opens the door for people who pretend to be scientists and who deliver messages that are, in fact, pseudoscience, but that fit with people's preconceptions to kind of surf on that. And so the fact that people, or in the case I was hoodwinked, the person pretended to be a doctor, and they looked completely respectable, and they put me in a tight spot. And on the whole, it's good that I trust this kind of people. I got screwed last time, but if I started to not believe anybody else, when anybody said to me that I didn't know already, I couldn't function.
Yeah, I should read the story just for our listeners. When I was walking back from university one day, a respectable-looking middle-aged man accosted me. He spun a good story. He was a doctor working at the local hospital. He had to rush to some urgent doctorly thing, but he lost his wallet and had no money for a cab ride. He was in dire need of €20. He gave me his business card, told me I could call the number and his secretary would wire the money back to me shortly. After some more cajoling, I gave him €20. There was no doctor of his name and no secretary at the end of the line. So you called and there was just nobody there. It was just a wrong number.
Yeah, it was an empty number.
Yeah. So, but there you see, here we can talk about the moral sense a little bit. I mean, we've all evolved some empathetic circuitry in our brain. We do care about people. We want to help other people, and the question is, when do we do that? And there, you were kind of put on the spot, and triggered the cues like, well, this is a reliable, good person trying to help people, so I should help him.
Yes, and also the choice that these people put you in is that either I give him the money or I'm essentially telling him that he's not a doctor. Like, I was just, obviously I was just taking out of money at the ATM, so he knew I had money. So I had, in a way, you have a choice between really saying that he's a fraud to his face, which is, if you're wrong, it's extremely rude and costly and bad, or the just paying 20. Obviously, if he had asked me for €1,000, I would have looked twice. I'm just thinking now that you're reading the story, it's funny that the fact that he had lost his wallet and still had a business card was also should have been suspicious.
Right. Yeah. So my guess is he had probably market tested this. Maybe ask for 50, ask for 100. Not getting many. He could get maybe 10 hits at 20, but maybe only 2 hits at 50. So you stick with 20. Somewhere in there is the right, the right amount that you're willing to risk, as opposed to calling him out on a bluff.
Yes.
Yeah, there does seem to be something in our nature. We don't want to offend people or challenge them unless it's just so obvious we have to. There's some risk, I guess, maybe reputational risk or hurting people's feelings or something like that. Just calling somebody out, no, I'm sorry, I think you're a liar, or I think you're a scam artist.
Yes, it's very difficult. I mean, but actually in the book, I also mentioned cases in which we do use the fact that we offend other people as a weapon. So one case in which you want to do that is if you want to mark your allegiance to a given group. So, and especially like a relatively fringe group, and you want to show them that you're okay with not belonging to polite society, and so you can spout the most offensive racist comments or the most asinine comments, and that tells the people from that group who share your views that you're fine with being rejected by most people, and therefore that you have no choice but to be friends with them. And so in some cases, so obviously as a rule we try to avoid offending people, but there are a few cases in which we revel in it and we use that to our advantage.
Yeah. I almost fell for one of these scams a few years ago. My religion editor for Skeptic was on vacation. He told me, I'm going away. My wife and I are going away. It was somewhere overseas. I'm like, okay, great. And then like a week later, I get an email from him saying, oh, Michael, gosh, I've lost my wallet and we can't get back to the airport and so on. Can you give me your credit card? And I just sort of blindly went, well, I know he's out. Wow, what a shame. So I type in and I hit send, and the moment I hit send, I went, oh, fuck. How could I, of all people, fall for this? Of course, I canceled the credit card right away and called him, and he was back home already. I'm like, yeah, I said, I think you got hacked. So whoever the scammer was somehow knew through his emails, I guess, once he hacked the email system, he was traveling, and that made for a good spin on the story.
Yeah, no, the same thing. This one, I knew not to fall for because it was implausible for some detail that the scammer couldn't have known. But the same thing, I guess, happened to many people, and it is indeed. I mean, it's very well done.
Yeah, and I had another recent one last year. I had a writer who had written 4 pieces for me from Ireland. But he was in some foreign university as a professor of psychology. But I never checked his credentials. His writing was pretty good, and he'd written for a dozen other publications that I knew about, and the subjects were interesting. So we published 2 online and 2 in print, and then one of my other editors got to fact checking him instead of his stories, and said, Michael, I'm not sure this guy is who you think he is. And I went, what? So I emailed him. I said, hey, some of my readers are kind of skeptical. Oh, yeah, no. Here's my professorship and here's my credentials and so on. I said, well, can you send me the actual transcripts from the university where you said you got your PhD? And he did. And then he sent me the actual diploma. And I thought, wow. So I sent that to my colleagues and they went, we just checked on there's some fake diploma site you can check. And sure enough, you could buy one of these things for like $20. So we contacted the university. He said he got his doctorate at, and they had no record of him ever being there. So it's like, so I called him out on it. He admitted that he faked the whole thing, and that was the end of his writing career. But, it's like, as an editor, of course, we fact check the stories pretty carefully, and I have 6 different proofers that go through everything, so we're pretty good about that. But I never fact checked one of my writers' credentials. I mean, now, do I have to do that now for all the writers? And
no, I mean, you hope not. I mean, there's a trade-off, obviously, between the cost of checking and the cost of being caught, of being tricked once in a while. And as a rule, I think that the consequences, even if the odds of being caught are relatively low because you don't check so much, in that case, he did get caught in the end, and then the consequences are obviously very dire because he's never going to write again under that name anyway.
Yeah,
he might obviously assume another identity now.
Right.
But so I guess it still makes sense. And I mean, as you can see, you had to do a lot of work in order to find out that person. So if you had to do the same thing for every writer, it would be it's not worth it.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Let's talk about signaling, costly signaling theory and virtue signaling. So much of your theory depends on communications in a social primate species like ours, and to what extent we honestly signal our intentions or we deceive a little bit. Here I'm thinking a little bit of Bob Triver's work on deception and self-deception, to what extent we signal to ourselves that we're honest because then it cues to other people we really believe what we say and so forth. So talk a little bit about your research on signaling.
Well, it's not necessarily my research, but the research that the field has done suggests that at least when it comes to lying, I'm not totally at the same line as Bob Triver's, because his idea is that so when you lie more convincingly if you actually believe the lie.
Yeah.
But there's actually not much good evidence for that, and that on the whole, people are terrible at spotting liars.
Right.
Really, we can't do it. No one can do it. Professionals can't do it. There's been no study showing that anybody is really much better than chance at spotting liars.
Even if the liar isn't believing the lie, even if the liar knows it's a lie, we're still not good at it. Okay, right.
Whether the liar knows, whether the liar doesn't know, in any possible case, we don't know, and we can't really do it. And the reason is that evolutionarily it makes sense in that there is no reason why we should be giving out cues that we're lying. Like there is no, if we were giving out such cues when we're lying, evolution should have suppressed them, because there's nothing, no physiological mechanism that would make that prohibitively costly to stop such cues. And so indeed, people are terrible at spotting liars. And the way we go about evaluating what people tell us instead is both we look at the content. So if you tell me something implausible, I'm not going to believe you. And then we look at whether people actually were right or not. So you remember what people tell you, and if it turns out they are wrong, you're going to call them liars, and you're not going to believe them in the future. So what keeps the whole thing standing isn't the fact that we're able to evaluate what people tell us on the spot, but the fact that people's reputations are at stake. And so once you accept that, then the importance of lying to yourself is much reduced, because whether you're lying to yourself or not, you can lie to people. What is going to keep you honest is not that they can't spot you and really immediately realize that you're lying, is that if you're saying something false, they will realize that later, and they will lower your reputation. Then again, whether you were believing the lie or not. Like if somehow I'm deluded and I believe that I can play basketball like Michael Jordan, and I tell you that, and you find out very quickly it's not true, the fact that I was being truthful in that I really believed it is going to make no difference in what you think of me.
Right. Yeah, okay, that actually makes sense. Okay, that makes sense. But what about the size of the lie? Does that matter for whether we can detect it or not?
Well, obviously, so we use plausibility. So if you tell me something implausible, I won't believe it. So I won't use the fact that you're fidgeting or not looking me in the eye or any of these superficial cues that are unreliable, but I will use the content. So yes, indeed, the whole thing about the big lie, this thing that the Nazis thought that the English had done during World War I, that just really doesn't work.
Yeah, here I'm thinking of Dan Ariely's research online, where people tend to exaggerate the scores that they got on some little task, like 10 to 15%. No one says I got 100% more than I actually did. And I think, if I recall, he argues that it's easier to get away with just a little bit of exaggeration. Maybe on dating sites, you say you're 3 inches taller than you actually are, but not a foot taller. Or you make $20,000 a year more, but you wouldn't say $2 million a year more than you make.
Yeah, no, exactly. And research on this sort of thing that has also shown that most people will believe they're much smarter than average, or that they're smarter than average, but not, for instance, that they're more punctual. Because with smart, you can always find a way of thinking of smarts in which you are actually sort of smarter. You're street smart. You're good at math. You have a wide general culture. Whereas being punctual, there's just one way of being punctual. So there's much less leeway in terms of selling yourself as someone who is punctual if you're not, whereas you can always sell yourself as being smart in one way or another.
Yeah. One of my favorite books is called The Invisible Hook, Pete Neeson's book on pirates.
Yeah.
And how pirates have a whole signaling system based on their own internal constitutions and rules and laws that they govern each other, sort of honor among thieves, as it were. Where so he talks about where they fly the skull and crossbones flag as a signal to other ships, we're going to come board you and take your stuff and kill you if we need to. Now, they don't actually want conflict with other ships because it's costly. So, but they have to sort of nourish a reputation of being badasses so that the victims will then just hand the stuff over without violence.
Yes. There's the whole logic. There's also the logic that Robert Frank argues, explains things like anger. So, I'm going to get angry, not because, I want to fight with you necessarily, but because I want to show you that I will fight if you screw with me. And so the idea is that you don't actually have to no one has to pay the cost in the idle situation. No one has to pay the cost. And the way I think that Frank, and to some extent maybe Listen went a little bit wrong, is that what makes these kind of signals honest is that you have to pay an extra cost if you don't do the deed. So if you look very angry and you express a lot of anger, and then someone still pisses you off and you don't do anything, then you lose a lot of credibility.
Right.
So it's not that people are able to tell from the display of anger whether it's truthful or not. It's just that you keep track of people's emotions, and you see whether actually their actions then fit with that. So I think we will have friends, for instance, who are who are very emotional. So they will cry easily, and they will express a lot of grief or express a lot of happiness, or maybe even a lot of anger. And we know to not take that seriously. Whereas we might have the proverbial very kind of taciturn grandfather who is if he sheds a tear, like this whole world is crumbling. So we know to take that into account, and even young children know that someone, for instance, who cries or complains for something that is not a big deal isn't reliable and isn't to be trusted.
Right. I was thinking of Christopher Baum's research in his book Moral Origins, where he talks about bullies and freeriders and psychopaths and hunter-gatherer groups and how the community deals with them. And they start with sort of being angry with them or expressing their displeasure at their actions of free riding or bullying. But at some point, they have to scale up if the person doesn't respond to physical violence and even capital punishment. And but he also talks about how hard it is to kill some big bully, and you have to get like sort of a bunch of guys in on it. And but it's also good to have a bunch of people in on it so that we all share the responsibility for offing this guy. And but the question is, why did we not evolve out all of the bullies? Why are there still 1% to 3% psychopaths and bullies and free riders?
Honestly, I don't know. It might be that it's not adaptive, that it's just a mishap. Obviously, everybody, we all have like organs that are not fully functional. I mean, some people say they have problems, so maybe it might be that they're missing something, or it might be that it's the end of a spectrum, and on the whole, it's mostly adaptive. There kind of the whole most of the variation is adaptive, but the extremes of the variation become maladaptive. I think it's really hard to tell because, as you were saying, the proportion of psychopaths is fortunately pretty low, and so you'd want to look at how they fare in like hunter-gatherer environments, and there'd be like so few of them, like the data would be extremely hard to acquire.
Yeah, I think it's that it's just too costly to get rid of every last liar, free rider, and so on. Societies can tolerate a small amount of cheating, free riding, and so on. Just look at the daily news that, despite all the laws about insider trading, it still happens. But most of the time it doesn't happen. Most people, most of the time. And society functions pretty well that way. Okay, so I consume a lot of content here, so I was just thinking about Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. It's a huge bestseller, as his books always are, because he's such a good storyteller. But as usual, he's getting hammered by social scientists for capitalizing on one particular theory and then spinning it with great stories. This is the default to truth. That humans just default to believing people, and that's why Hitler got away with what he did. The exception being, of course, Churchill didn't believe him, Chamberlain did, and so on and so forth. So walk us through a little bit about, you don't have to address the default to truth, but it's along the lines of what you're talking about. When do we believe people? When do we not believe people? And what do we default to if we default to anything?
So I think I very much think that the opposite of what Gladwell and other indeed social scientists on whom his work rests. He's saying that I don't think the default is that we trust people. The default is that we don't trust people. And it looks the other way because for most of the people we encounter, we actually have a lot of these kind of coarse cues telling us that we should trust them. So they look like us, they dress like us, they speak our language. They seem to belong to environments in which they're integrated with other people who should monitor them. And so we have in most cases when you talk to someone, you have a lot of cues telling you that person is a normal, well-functioning human being who you have reasons to trust. So it's not like you'd have to think of, I don't know if you saw someone in the street who was dressed in a completely bizarre fashion, who barely spoke your language, and who was asking money from you, your first reaction wouldn't be to trust them.
Right. Well, so let's talk about Hitler and the Nazis and so on. If we don't default to propaganda and ideology like that, then how does an ideology like that get a toehold in a society and then spread, even if the majority don't believe it?
So actually that's I spent quite a bit of time on this. So there are now a few studies on Nazi propaganda that are really very, very well done, and they show quite conclusively that it had very little effect. So there are studies there are studies that have just looked at archival material. Actually, a lot of the material, ironically, is from the Nazis' own intelligence agency.
I lost you there, Hugo. Okay, there. Yeah, I lost you for a second there. So,
sorry. I'll say that again.
Yep.
Sorry about that. So, so the Nazis' own intelligence services were trying to figure out what the Germans were thinking, because they couldn't, as a rule, say it out loud, especially anything negative. Obviously, they would be killed or at least imprisoned. And so we see in these reports that the Germans were widely distrustful of German propaganda. That is completely true after Stalingrad, when they really didn't believe anything that was coming out of the radio. They had to turn on the BBC, risking their own lives in the process. And even before that, you can see that German propaganda failed in most dimensions. So, for instance, they tried to push for euthanasia of the handicapped, and no Germans didn't buy that at all. And they tried to make the industrial workers dislike communism. They didn't buy that at all. And they tried to make the Germans like the Nazis, and the Germans never liked the Nazis. They kind of liked Hitler. They never really liked the Nazis, except the people who were actually directly benefiting from being Nazis. So on the whole, it's mostly a litany of failures. And even in the case of anti-Semitism, we see that the propaganda mostly reinforced the anti-Semitism of people who were already anti-Semitic. So it maybe allowed them to express it more forcefully or to engage in more anti-Semitic acts, because clearly it was approved by the regime. But the people who were the least anti-Semitic were not affected at all, or on the contrary, became even less anti-Semitic. And so, on the whole, it had very little effect, and that's quite striking. And obviously, when you see the huge rallies, with Hitler and everybody kind of seemingly approving in unison, you have to keep in mind that obviously this is still a very, very small portion of German people, and that even them might not have had much of a choice. Clearly, many people were there monitoring their behavior, and you didn't want to be the guy who would not salute.
Yeah, if we're gullible to anything, it's this idea that we're gullible to the point where all Germans believe the Nazis. So you get this meme that I still hear all the time. How do you turn a sophisticated, cultured, intelligent peoples like the Germans into Nazis? And your answer is they didn't turn them into Nazis.
No. And indeed, even if you look at the soldiers, you find the typical behavior in soldiers, that they were mostly fighting for their unit, for the small group of people who were around them. And indeed, they were very kind of passionate about that, the way most soldiers are. But they cared extremely little about the ideology. You can see that in their letters, in other evidence. And you can also see that, for instance, in the behavior that they weren't fighting to the death. So, for instance, on the Eastern Front, they were to some extent fighting to the death, because they knew the Russians would treat them very poorly, as they had treated the Russians before. Whereas on the Western Front, there were a lot of defections, and when it was limited, it's because they were afraid of being shot, not because they were kind of hardcore supporters.
Yeah. Do you know this quote from Hermann Goering? You probably do. When the psychiatrist Gustav Gilbert interviewed him at the Nuremberg trials, Gilbert asked Goering how it was possible to build and sustain public support for a war effort, especially in Germany, which had barely recovered from the still recent disaster of World War I. Goering's reply: while of course the people don't want war, why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That's understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Anyway, I thought...
No, that's completely right. And indeed, as soon as even before the war, as soon as most of the government money went into the war effort, and the Germans had to, many of them were kind of starving because they had no more food or money. They hated that, and they kind of supported the war, the war in Austria and in Czechoslovakia, because they saw that as bringing back former German territory, but they never wanted to go to war against France or against England. I mean, obviously, he's wrong in that it's easier to drag people into war in a dictatorship than in the democracy. But it's either way. In both cases, people don't want war as a rule, especially not the people who are going to fight it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the research in your book where you cite Ian Kershaw. And he's really innovated a lot of the research on Nazi Germany, particularly in the 30s, of what was really going on, to what extent they really believed, and so on. Here, I'm thinking of the psychological principle of pluralistic ignorance, or the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else believes, but they don't. And in fact, you can have a majority of people not believe in a particular ideology, but if they think everybody else does. But there's one more element, the element of punishment for not going along with it. So you have to stay silent.
Yes, no, and clearly that's true for every dictatorship. So it's really striking because every kind of authoritarian regime anyway, because people, point to propaganda, even though we know for a fact that in all of these regimes, from North Korea to Stalinist Russia to Nazi Germany, clearly the slightest slip up could lead you and your family to a concentration camp. And so the fact that you'd need anything else to explain people's behavior is puzzling. Like, obviously that's enough. Like, you don't need to explain any behavior through propaganda once you have the threat of imminent death to explain the behavior.
One of my favorite stories in Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, the suggestion that unsupportable ideologies can levitate in midair by vicious circles of punishment of those who fail to punish has some history behind it. During witch hunts and purges, people get caught up in cycles of preemptive denunciation. Here I'm thinking of Twitter.
Yeah, fair enough, yeah.
Everyone tries to out a hidden heretic before the heretic outs him. Signs of heartfelt conviction become precious commodity. Solzhenitsyn recounted a party conference in Moscow that ended with a tribute to Stalin. Everyone stood and clapped wildly for 3 minutes, then 4, then 5. And then no one dared to be the first to stop. After 11 minutes of increasingly stinging palms, a factory worker on the platform finally sat down, followed by the rest of the grateful assembly. He was arrested that evening and sent to the gulag for 10 years.
Yeah. No, that's the dynamic, and that's how you keep people in line. And indeed, there's, as you are describing, there's this pluralistic ignorance that adds on top of it that makes people even more frightful of starting a rebellion, of starting to organize anything. It doesn't make them believe in what the regime is saying, but it stops collective action.
Right. I mean, it's too costly to be the first person to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes if you're not sure other people are going to join you.
Yes, and not only do you have to believe that they agree with you, but you have to believe that they will actually commit and go down to the street and engage in costly behavior in the same way as you are describing in small scale societies. You have to make sure that the other guys are going to attack the bully with you. Otherwise, the bully is just going to kill you.
Yeah. Yeah, I also liked your section on the growth of Christianity. Again, another one of these memes amongst atheist circles is, somehow intelligent people were just, brainwashed overnight by these, cult-like religions. And before you know it, 2 billion people believe it. But as you show, just a 1% growth. And 1% growth means almost nobody's being converted.
Yes.
And most of that probably is through family just having more children.
Yes.
And, from what I know of the little data there is on Mormons and their missionaries, they have almost no success in those missions.
Yes. Yeah, it's like 99.9% failure. It's extremely but we have this huge bias when we look at the successes because they're very obvious. You see try to explain the people who have been converted, but you don't see all the people who they have failed to convert. And for every kind of proselytizing, that's always the same. And it's true for advertising, for political campaigns. You see with someone who has been influenced or who seems as if they have been influenced, but you forget the vast majority of the failures because they're just essentially invisible.
Yeah. So who is that for then? Why does the Mormon Church send out these missionaries knowing that they're going to fail in a huge level?
Well, I guess there's maybe the fact that maybe the 0.1% or 1% or whatever it is is enough to justify the cost. or maybe they see that as an enterprise that is worthwhile if it's an accord, like going to church or praying or fasting or doing a number of things that are mandated by religion.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a way to get people invested in the religion even more, such that you get this effect where there's just too much loss aversion. You've got so much invested. What's that called? Where
you've suddenly publicly committed a lot to your faith, so it makes it even harder to change your mind.
Yeah,
I guess.
Yeah, the sunk cost fallacy. Yeah, I've put too much in it now to get out. Yeah. Put too much in it to back out now. And same thing with the tithing. You talk about 10%. That's not a trivial amount. 10%. And the Mormons are serious about this.
To pay. The Mormons actually they do pay it, but they get something in return. It's not like the peasants in the Middle Ages who they had a nice cathedral, but maybe they didn't do that much for them. Whereas the Mormons have social services, they have a whole lot of things. It's much more. I mean, my understanding, I don't know the Mormon faith very well at all, but my understanding is that it's much more democratic in how the money is spent than the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages would have been, for instance.
Yeah, no, they're super good about taking care of their own. It's a great example of kind of an inner logic to a religion where they really do take care of each other. And from what I've read, they're pretty serious about this. Like capital gains taxes on property that you sold, they want 10% of that in addition to the 15% you give to the government for capital gains. They keep track of that. They want tax returns.
Good for them.
Yeah. But again, it's part of that sunk cost. Well, I can't back out now. I mean, and I remember going to one of the Mormon temples, not in Salt Lake City. It was one of the other big cities. And I wanted to take a tour of it. And they said, well, you have to be a member in good standing. I said, I'm a U.S. citizen in good standing. They're going, no. I said, I pay my taxes. They go, no, we're not talking about that. It was really funny. So I didn't get to go in. So I pressed him on that. I said, does that mean tithing? He goes, oh, yeah. We want our 10%. So, yeah, okay. So again, with religion, so what you're describing is again this belief system that's kind of hovering in midair, held up there by everyone believing that everyone else believes it. So this leads me to ask: to what extent do most believers not really believe, or are they kind of skeptical, or they're just signaling that they believe and they don't? How do you get that information?
So it's hard, and the problem is that the word belief is itself very kind of ambivalent. So in the book, I use the contrast drawn by Dan Sperber as well between reflective and intuitive beliefs. So intuitive beliefs are beliefs. What we usually call beliefs are intuitive beliefs. So that for now, I believe there is a computer in front of me, and my behavior will be guided by the fact that I know there is a computer in front of me. I can draw a whole lot of inferences about that. I can what I can do with it, what I can't do with it, etc., etc. So that's intuitive, and most of our beliefs are intuitive. But we also have reflective beliefs that are kind of isolated, that don't touch the rest of our beliefs, that don't interact with much else, that don't guide our behavior, and most kind of weird, insane or kind of religious or bizarre or kind of pseudoscientific beliefs are like that. And so even if you take something like the properties of the Christian God, it's supposed to be omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omnipresent, and all that. So on paper, Christians believe that, and they will, if you ask them, is God omnipotent, they will tell you yes. But the way they think about God in their everyday lives is more like a typical agent who can be distracted. So if you pray to God, you're more likely to attract his attention than if you're not praying. You're still trying to do things, hiding away from him, even though he's supposed to know everything. And so there's this two layers. So it's not that they don't believe that God is omnipotent; they really believe it. They will tell you 100% God is omnipotent. So it's just they believe it in a way that is different from the way they believe that there's a computer in front of them.
Yeah, in my sometimes debates with theists, I'll say something like, "So you claim to be monotheistic. There's just one God." But Jesus was also God? No, Jesus was the Son of Man, but the Son of God. But he's also God. Yeah, he's also God. And the Holy Spirit is also God, 3 in 1, 1 in 3. And, theologians have been, tangling with this problem for 1,000 years. And, at some point, most believers just go, it's just the way it is. It's just, God made it that way. I don't know, if you think about the resurrection. So, Jesus died for our sins, but Jesus is God. So in a way, God sacrifices himself to save us from himself. I mean, this is just barking mad if you just think about it for a moment, but I think you can't think about it too deeply along those lines.
No, most people don't, and indeed it plays these kind of very explicit reflective beliefs play a very little role in most people's religious lives. Like it doesn't. That's not why they go to church. That's not why they when they give to charity. That's not why they believe there is a God. So most of these beliefs have been invented by theologians because they wanted to create some kind of coherent doctrine, which is kind of what they're paid for, and then they kind of trickle down to average believers, but in a way that is very superficial.
Yeah, when I think of people going to church, when I think of all the arguments that theists and atheists have, because I do a lot of these, people don't care about the 6 different arguments for the origins of the universe, the ontological argument, and so forth. That's not why they're there. They don't care about evolution or the Big Bang or any of that stuff. It's really more social.
It is, and it's funny. So just yesterday, one of my students was presenting her work for that term. And she was presenting a contrast between the Krampus ceremony that takes place in Austria, where she's from. So it's a ceremony that takes place around Christmas time, where people dress up with these really terrifying masks, and they have sticks that they use to kind of beat up children, kind of nicely enough. And you have you see the procession, you see the people kind of lining up the streets, and they kind of ring bells. And then she was showing how in Benin, in Africa, she had seen nearly exactly the same practice. Obviously, completely unrelated cultural thing. So you have people dressed up in masks that pretend to be these evil spirits, and they beat up kind of bad children or kind of evil, kind of naughty kids with sticks, and they have bells making noise or kind of other instruments making noises. And obviously, in the case of Austria, they don't believe in Santa Claus, in that these spirits are real. They just they do that for fun because it's kind of nice, it's the tradition, and it's entertaining and it's memorable, and it has a lot of attributes that make people want to do it year after year. But it's the same in Benin. So in Benin, maybe people will think, they do all this because they believe in the spirits and because they have all this complex theology. No, they do it for the same reasons that the Austrians do it. And on top of it, maybe they take it a little bit more seriously. But it doesn't make that much of a difference.
In the witch crazes of the early modern period, to what extent do you think Western Christendom, Western Europeans, really believed that women could fly on brooms and cavort with demons and cause floods and diseases and the cow to die and so on? Or to what extent was it kind of a social manipulation of, minor people who had no power, something like that?
I think, obviously it's a very kind of complex phenomenon, and there are many different explanations. So in some cases, it was, people use these widespread beliefs in witchcraft that we find in most human cultures. You find kind of similar beliefs in order to persecute people who they wanted persecuted in the first place. So typically isolated older women who they wanted to get the land off, or the wealth off, and they would say, she's a witch, and they would kind of get rid of them, and everybody in the community was kind of going along with it because it suited them fine. They don't target people who are powerful enough, because then they will people might retaliate. So obviously there are exceptions, but that's the rule. And in many ways, so we have this image of witch hunting as being always resulting in burning on the fire or something. And it's actually very much the exception. So in most cultures, when someone is being designated a witch, they have to pay a small cost. They have to pay a small fine. They have to do some ritual. They have to engage in some kind of minor kind of punishment. They've something really not very significant. And what that shows is that there's a disconnect between the crimes they are accused of and the powers that is attributed to them, and the leniency of the punishment. So and even in Western Europe, even during the witch craze, most witches were given the chance of look, actually, you can repent and you can confess, and then you'll be fine. You'll just be maybe you have to do penance for a year or something. And then again, if you really believe these people are poisoning cattle or even poisoning people or eating their children or something completely nuts like this, you shouldn't be that lenient.
Yeah. Well, I often think of science as displacing the witch theory of causality. So we don't need witches to explain bad weather. We have climatology. We don't need witches to explain diseases. We have epidemiology and the germ theory of disease and so forth. In a way, science is the scientific understanding of causality has kind of replaced the supernatural, superstitious witch theory of causality. But I think, following your line of thinking here, that's not strictly true. There was other elements involved. The social aspect of the witch crazes, I think, also played a role.
Yes, so clearly, the beliefs in witchcraft helped explain things that people wanted explanations for. But what you're describing is true as well, in that once you have like a nascent, even some kind of nascent belief that witches have the powers that they do, it starts making sense for a witch to confess, because if you're suspected of being a witch, if everybody sort of really believes you're a witch, if you confess, then everybody thinks, oh, actually they've confessed, now they've repented, and they're going to use their powers for good, and you're fine. Whereas if everybody keeps suspecting you're a witch and you keep denying it, you're in trouble. And so once you have like a little bit of sufficient kind of suspicion, then it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle that the people confess. And then once the person has confessed, you think, well, obviously they were a witch. I mean, no one would confess if they weren't actually a witch. But in fact, the pressures were such that it was sufficient for the person to make it in their interest for the person to confess. And then once obviously the confessions, as I was saying, really will reinforce the belief that witchcraft is real.
Right. False confessions, another interesting psychological phenomenon. Why would anybody falsely admit to doing a crime they didn't commit?
Interestingly, there are cases in which it is, weirdly enough, in your interest. So the reason people confess, not false confessions, but they confess generally, it's because when other people think you've done something bad, it's better for your reputation to confess, to kind of own up to it, and to usually pay some kind of reparation, rather than to keep denying that you've done anything bad. And clearly, if you have a friend and you suspect they've done something a bit iffy, if they keep denying it, you're just not going to be friends with them. Whereas, I'm sorry, I did this, and they do whatever they need to do, and then things can be fine. And so the reason people confess is when they believe that other people are so sure that they're guilty that it makes no sense to keep denying it. They're better off admitting they've done it. But so in that model, what matters isn't whether they've done it or not. It's what other people believe.
Right.
If you've done something and no one thinks you've done it, you don't have to confess. But the converse is that if you haven't done anything, but everybody else thinks you have, and you can't change your mind, you can't change their minds because it's something that is kind of hard to prove that you haven't done, like witchcraft typically, then you're better off confessing. So, for instance, like in the US, in some states, they have something that's called the Alford plea, which allows you to plead guilty while saying you're innocent. And in a way, it makes sense because if you're in a situation in which you feel that you have no chance of convincing a jury, you think you're innocent, you're innocent, but you realize that it looks extremely bad for you, and so that leaves, and some people really hate that. It leaves open the possibility of saying, well, look, I'm going to plead guilty because it makes much more sense for me to plead guilty. I will have a reduced sentence, but I'm actually innocent.
Right. Yeah, we're undergoing this right now with this college admission scam in the United States. I don't know if you've been following this, but these wealthy parents basically buying their kids in to the side door of major universities rather than the front door where you just give the university money for a building.
Yes, it's more expensive, I think.
But a lot of them are just taking plea deals. Like, I don't want to fight about it. I'll just serve my 2 weeks in jail and then be done with it. And and others are going to fight it, but the state has made it clear, if you fight this and you lose, we are going to destroy your life. So others that see that think, ugh, boy.
Yes. So indeed, most judicial systems are based on confession in one way or another. So in the US, it's plea deals, which are a form of implicit confession. In other countries like Japan, it's straightforward confession. So like 99% of cases are prosecuted based on the confession. And it is extremely convincing. Like when someone confesses, it is really hard for people not to believe it. And actually, we run a kind of an experiment on this. One of the things that also makes confession such a good way of legitimating judicial decisions is that they're very easy to communicate. So let's say if I have like a whole lot of circumstantial evidence maybe I can convince you that the guy is guilty, but then if you try then to tell someone else why the guy is guilty, you're going to forget half of it. It's not going to be as convincing. Whereas if I tell you, well, he confessed, you can tell somebody else, well, he confessed, and you can tell somebody else, well, he confessed. And so it's very easy to reach the public knowledge and public agreement on the fact that someone is guilty if you base that on the confession. Whereas if you base that on any other type of evidence, it's much more complex.
Right. I did a TV show once on lie detection. It was a two-part. And the first part was on the stuff you talk about, how people are terrible at detecting lies. And we had on these people that said they could tell, but they couldn't when we tested them. Oh, the gaze goes to the left and all this bullshit. And they at the time, this was right after Clinton had lied about Monica Lewinsky, and he kept looking off to the left and nervously sipping on his Coke and so on. It's like these were allegedly accused, which is nonsense. But then the lie detector itself, the polygraph, it turns out this is just bullshit. It doesn't work. And we had this guy, Doug Williams from Oklahoma City. He was an ex-Oklahoma City cop. Now he is a consultant for defense attorneys to show why the lie detection is not good. So he told us the first day, he was trained on how to do it, and then his boss sent him in to test the suspect, and he came back and he said, "Well, boss, I think he's lying." And the boss says, "We know he's lying. They're all lying. Get in there and get the confession." He goes, "Oh, this is a confession getting machine." Right.
Yes,
He goes,
it is exactly right.
And then the boss tells him, and tell him we have like 3 eyewitnesses and we have his fingerprints too. And he goes, "But we don't." He goes, "So what?"
That's okay. No, it's exactly. There's this famous scene in The Wire as well when they put the guy's hand on the Xerox machine, and they tell you if something, the machine is going to print a sheet with saying yes or no based on whether you're lying or not, in order to get him to confess. And that's something that I think David Simon said he had actually seen or heard of. But yes, lie detectors are ways of getting people to confess.
Yeah.
And ironically, the case in which they do detect some kind of nervousness. But obviously, most people who are accused wrongfully are also nervous, so that's why they're useless. And another reason why they're useless is that the people you really want to catch, like maybe psychopaths or spies, they're not nervous because they're lying in a way that is completely. They have no qualms, no ambiguity. They're just completely happy to lie, and so you don't catch the people who you really want to catch, and you catch a lot of people who are just nervous because they're being wrongly accused.
This guy told us how to beat it, that on the test questions where you're not supposed to sort of flatline any nervousness, squeeze your anal sphincter muscle and it'll drive your blood pressure way up. So I got hooked up and I tried. I squeeze the anal sphincter muscle, and sure enough, my blood pressure spiked. It's like, holy crap, that really works. So you spike them all, then they can't tell any difference.
And then you can tell anything.
That's so bad. By the way, parenthetically, I want to back to the Nazi thing for just a moment. I forgot to mention this. Do you know Daniel Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners?
Yes.
Yeah. So same kind of thing. He kind of got hammered for this thesis that I think is held up fairly well, that the Nazis were capitalizing on people who were already anti-Semitic, particularly in Poland, who were only too happy to see the Jews go and take their stuff and take their homes and whatnot. So again, capitalizing on people that are already believe what you.
Yes, you're helping them organize, and you're clearly they're playing a role. But if these people hadn't been fiercely anti-Semitic in the first place, they wouldn't have done it. Yeah.
So back to your intuitions here. I liked the part in your book about if you're standing on the earth and somebody says it's flat, and you look around, it's like, yeah, that makes sense intuitively. And this is why I think that part of the problem we have with climate science and evolutionary theory is that it's counterintuitive. No one ever sees a species evolve to another species. You can't see it. It's an inference from the fossil record. That's it. And you don't see glaciers melting in your lifetime. Well, maybe we are now, but you don't see, or you don't see continents move. Continental drift just seems insane.
And people thought it was insane for a long time, indeed.
Yeah, and most of quantum physics is totally counterintuitive, and the expansion of the universe and all these kind of sort of grand. None of it really is intuitive.
So that's why from my perspective, when people wonder why people don't trust science more, and why don't people accept evolution, climate change, and everything. And the thing that really puzzles me is why so many people do accept that, because most people have no understanding of the underlying science. And most people don't know scientists personally who could really explain them, people who they could kind of relate to and trust more easily. Indeed, most people can barely kind of cite, the name of a living scientist. Um, and so it's crazy that in spite of that, most people still accept most scientific theories, at least, nominally. Obviously, they don't. It's very superficial. It's very shallow. There's no real understanding, which is fine because people are busy with other things. But I think that's what's more interesting to me is obviously the practical concern is with the people who are resisting. But the scientific challenge, I think, is more to understand why so many people actually believe in these completely crazy theories that are supported by people they don't know for reasons they don't understand.
Yeah, I think in a way, I wouldn't call it faith, but it's confidence in a system that works really well. So when religious people say, well, you have faith in science, it's not faith. It's that, it's worked so well. And I know that when I turn to the authorities, again, it's not an argument from authority directly. It's that I know that, like my quantum physics friends or physics friends at Caltech, I know they check each other. So that when this one tells me something, I think, well, I don't know if it's true or not. What do I know? I'm a social scientist, historian, not a physicist. But I know that his colleagues check him. So there's some confidence there I have that, he's not bullshitting me.
Yes, but even that basic knowledge of how science works, it's not clear that many people have it. So that typically you have many people will have an idea of science which is more based around kind of lone geniuses or this sort of things. Like few people know about peer review, few people know about how much scientists disagree with each other vociferously all the time. So yes, I mean honestly, I'm not sure. So clearly, people use coarse cues. They realize, if it sounds more mathematical, if it sounds more like a hard science, it's more reliable. And on the whole, it's these are very good cues. But it's not transparent how these cues are acquired and why people use them to believe even the craziest things, like as you were saying, quantum physics or relativity theory or plate tectonics. And obviously, it's much easier when these beliefs have no consequence. So the fact that I believe in plate tectonics, it's like then it's a paradigmatic case of a reflective beliefs. It makes no difference whatsoever in my behavior or in any other of my beliefs.
Right.
But yet I accept it. And it's interesting that people do that.
Well, it's a socially accepted system, science now. In fact, it's one reason why creationists, for example, make these arguments about the science, because before the age of science, they didn't need to make that argument. It's just creationism was the only model around. So the moment Darwin offered an alternative, and then science became sort of politically and socially, culturally dominant, I think they felt they had to address the science directly. In other words, for example, to say that the dating techniques are flawed, or the methods used to measure the size of the universe are off by orders of magnitude, so it can't be that, and so on. Because otherwise they can't just say, well, that's my faith. Because then what?
Yes, you need to have something else to compete in the field of intellectual life. You need some kind of scientific or expertise credentialed that will help you. And you see that from the very beginning. So that another student was presenting her work on spiritism and kind of mesmerism, how at the second half of the 19th century, when people were believing in spirits and kind of turning tables and all that. And obviously, people have always believed in spirits, and it's likely they will always believe in spirits in one way or another. But the shape it took at that stage was really something much more sciencey. So it's just like actually we can communicate with them in a way. It's completely coherent with scientific beliefs, and indeed it might even have been reinforced by them. That's the point that some historians have been trying to make, that things like electricity or that the telegraph that seem completely miraculous, and you have things you can communicate remotely, you can activate things remotely. That makes it actually more plausible that things like that spirits could maybe make the table turn.
Yes.
So from the very beginning of science, kind of more intuitively compelling beliefs have kind of masqueraded, have pretended to be scientific, because, as you were saying, that's what they have to do to remain kind of valid amongst the most kind of educated classes.
Arthur C. Clarke's third law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yes, indeed.
And I did my doctoral dissertation on Alfred Russel Wallace and how he differed, in particular, from Darwin.
Mm-hmm.
And he argued, he was kind of a hyper selectionist. He argued that there's no reason natural selection would create a brain as large as ours, capable of aesthetic appreciation, mathematical abilities, and so on, what would be the purpose of that? A chimp-sized brain is perfectly good. And so he
Works for them.
Yeah, yeah, right. That, there's some he sort of directing force to the whole thing. He wasn't a religious believer in any traditional sense, but he kind of felt there was a teleology to the universe leading toward this kind of level of spirituality and hyperintelligence and that sort of thing. But he also spent a lot of time going to seances and phrenology and all this whole. He got involved in the spiritualism movement. And Darwin and Huxley both were just distressed about this. It's like, how can this great man, this theoretician, this great observer, and so on, fall for this codswallop? It's just crazy. And so there I got to thinking about temperament differences or personality differences, and back to this, how open-minded should you be? What if it turned out he was right, and spiritualism is a real thing, and Darwin was just too close-minded? Of course, this is what really current critics of skeptics like me say today, that, you're just close to this other world that's really out there, Shermer. It's like, yeah, but the evidence is so dicey for it that I would have to make this leap of faith that I just can't do.
Yeah. Yes, and it's, I don't have a good explanation for why people who seem to be, equally intelligent, equally well-educated, would go one way or the other. Clearly, it feels as if the content of the beliefs, like when you I guess the difference is that the extra beliefs that people would have you believe, even though they're we think they're wrong, are things that are intuitively compelling as a rule that you find in most societies. That people, it seems, most humans are kind of somewhat inclined to believe by nature, somewhat, like beliefs in spirits, beliefs in some kind of supernatural life. And in a way, the very fact that you have these human universals should make us wary of these beliefs, because that gives you another reasons for why people believe them. Is that, well, there seems to be a natural cultural inclination for humans to produce this kind of beliefs, and so once you are able to explain these beliefs that way, then that's enough. You don't need to explain them in some other way, such as that the phenomena are actually real.
Yeah, I played with this idea in The Believing Brain about patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in random noise, whether they're there or not. And so my examples were Richard Feynman wins the Nobel Prize for having this vision of quantum fields, and he has the Feynman diagrams sort of showing how they work. He had this sort of vision of how this happens, and this is all great. And then I contrast him with John Nash, who also won the Nobel Prize. Mm-hmm. For seeing, these patterns in game theory and so forth, the Nash equilibrium. But Nash also saw patterns that weren't real. He was schizophrenic. Now, this is just sort of a speculative idea, this idea of between genius and madness, that it all has to do with finding patterns. And if you're super open to seeing things as real, once in a while, you're going to come across something that's actually real, that no one else saw. Here, I think of Kary Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize for the PCR system method of genetics. But he believed all kinds of goofy stuff. I mean, astrology and HIV doesn't cause AIDS. And he was, I think, a vaccine skeptic and just on and on. He had all kinds of goofy ideas he would regale me with. And so I'm just sitting here listening to these stories thinking, well, this guy won the Nobel Prize. So obviously he's smart and he can see things that I can't see. But why does he believe this other stuff that pretty much, most scientists are skeptical of?
Yes, no, it's. Obviously, another example that we used in our former book is Linus Pauling, who won 2 Nobel Prizes, not even another one, and who was a fervent believer that vitamin C could cure everything. So he started with kind of curing common cold, but at the end he really thought it could cure cancer, AIDS, everything. And there was no getting him to change his mind. Clearly, then again, kind of completely brilliant person. So I think yes. As you were saying, it's partly maybe because they are so brilliant. It's not a bad strategy for them to trust their intuition, and so that's really what makes you realize as we were pointing out earlier, the social value of science. It's because people are checking on each other that they're checking whether they have the same intuitions or not, and mostly whether the data, whether actually experiments and facts will fit with the intuitions, that the whole thing works. And so, especially because, as you were saying as well, most scientific beliefs are counterintuitive. And so, by definition, when they're first formulated, they will sound crazy to most people. And so, what science is just extremely good at doing is to explore the space of weird hypotheses. And most of the new hypotheses that will be generated will be false. And and it's good that some people persevere and believe in them and really want to defend them, because a few of them will actually be right. And science is just good at sorting out which ones are actually right or not in the end. But the trait, that Pauling had, that this other Nobel Prize were describing had, of just having these ideas that they really believe strongly in. I guess if you don't have that, you can't become a Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
It's like you have to push something that other people don't think is going to work, and you actually think is going to work, and you have to push it in spite of everything. And obviously, most people do that fail. Most people, don't become Nobel Prizes.
That's right. And I'm fond of saying the reason scientists are skeptical of most of these crazy hypotheses is because most hypotheses turn out to be wrong. So here, the default position is the null hypothesis, that your hypothesis is not true until you prove otherwise. Go ahead, give us your best shot. And if you don't, well, too bad. That's just the way it goes.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Which is why I think an argument for climate science, for getting people to accept climate science, this 97% figure you often see quoted, it's not that 97% of scientists, it's that massive study on, it was like 13,000 papers, 97% of them all concluded that climate change is real and human caused. Okay, what about the other 3%? What if they're right? And the authors of this study show that, but the other 3% don't converge to this other alternative theory that's just as good. It's the sun, spots, or whatever, or volcanic activity or something like that. No, they're all over the board. They have no consensus, but the 97% all converge. So this consilience of inductions, as William Ewell called it, this convergence of inductions to one particular hypothesis. That leads me to think, even though I'm not a climate scientist, I try to read the papers. They're very complex, very mathematical, computer models. I don't really get it. But I think, 97%, okay, it's probably real.
Yes. No. I mean, that's always the best heuristic. Believe the scientific consensus. Obviously, in some cases, maybe you'll be wrong, but it's going to be extremely rare. And when you're wrong, it's usually in a way that is, let's say if before Einstein, you believe that Newton was right, and then actually it turns out he was wrong in some points, and Einstein was right. It was still better to believe Newton than any other alternative until Einstein came along. And so it's just as a very rough heuristic. It's extremely reliable. It's really crazy how well science works. Obviously, that works better in some fields than in others. So there are many, like in social psychology, for instance, or in other branches of psychology. There are things that would have been, I think, pretty consensual 20 years from 20 years ago that nowadays no one believes in.
Yeah.
So as a psychologist, I'm not saying you should believe nothing I'm saying, but obviously people know that they should take different disciplines with more or less of a grain of salt. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's. I'm going to be mindful of your time. Kind of wrap up here, talking about actionable ideas here for what we can do about beliefs that people hold that we're pretty sure are incorrect. Say climate skeptics, vaccine skeptics, creationists, and so on. What's the best approach to take? If let's say you're dealing with a climate skeptic, he doesn't know anything about climate science. I don't know anything about climate science. It seems to be so politicized.
The thing is, it really it depends, because it will depend on why they believe that or why they profess it. So if you take some climate deniers and some anti-vax people, in particular the most kind of vocal and extreme ones, it's plausible that they hold these beliefs as a way of kind of burning bridges, as I was briefly describing earlier, as a way of signaling their allegiance to a given group. And so if that's the case, then there is no point in trying to change their minds, because they haven't reached these beliefs through kind of logical kind of inferential processes. They're holding them precisely because they piss off everybody else. And so just pointing at how annoying and how false these beliefs are just actually reinforces their point.
Right.
And so that's not gonna do it. And it seems as if, I mean, it's kind of hard, but the best solution would be to try to reintegrate these people into the fold in some way, to get them actually, look, believe whatever you want, but you still, you can still be integrated in society. Things can still work well for you. You don't have to be part of these fringe groups of kind of crazy people, and hopefully that might help them abandon their belief, but it's not something one individual can do necessarily. But in many ways, when you're dealing with that kind of motivation, just going face to face, it's self-defeating. But then obviously you still have a lot of people who work more on the fence, who just they don't really know, and these people, information should get them to some extent. And so for instance, there are studies showing that just presenting information about the scientific consensus does convince people to some extent. Or presenting information about how the scientists reach their conclusions and what is the mechanism behind climate change also works to some extent. So when it is a lack of information, then providing more information actually works.
Right, particularly if it's presented visually, where people can see in very simple graphs what's going on, like the famous graphs showing the increase in CO2 gases and temperature, something like that. Our visual brains, primate visual brains, are impressed by that. Here, I try to take politics off the table. Like, for example, it's mostly conservatives, big free market, pro-free market capitalists who are skeptical of global warming. Why would that be? Well, because they think that this is all a tool by the left to control business, control industry. So you got to take that off the table. You just say, look, you can keep your capitalism. I love free markets too. It's all great. But, this is a great opportunity for green technology. You can become a billionaire like Elon Musk, something like that. So you take that off the table.
Yes, no, yeah. Then again, you really have to, the first step is to try to understand where the person you're talking to is coming from and what are their motivations. And in many cases, they're not transparent even necessarily to them.
Right.
But it's still good to try to understand, then again, where they're coming from. And then you try to address that and to adjust your arguments based on that. Otherwise, it's hard. And that's one of the reasons why mass persuasion, kind of mass scale communication is usually extremely inefficient. Is because we have many, many different reasons to disagree with a given message, and you can't address them all in a single message. And so if I talk to you about something, I can, counter-argue, I can truly explain why I believe this, I can listen to your specific arguments and anecdotes and thoughts. But if I do that at scale, then you can't do that, and it's extremely difficult to persuade a lot of people at once.
Yeah, so it depends how committed they are to these deeper religious or political beliefs. If you give a choice to a Christian between Jesus and Darwin, Jesus is going to win every time. So you got to take that off the table. I have to try to approach Christians by saying, maybe evolution was God's way of creating the diversity of life in the same way that Newton argued. Well, actually, Darwin argued about Newton that gravity was God's way of creating solar systems and so on, and that it was perfectly acceptable. So evolution's the same thing. It's just kind of, God created nature. Nature creates a diversity of life through natural selection. You can keep your Jesus, in other words.
Yes, argumentation works by showing people that there are other beliefs that are coherent with what they're thinking. That makes it actually more plausible to accept what you're saying. So if you're trying to remove any inconsistencies between what you're saying and what you want to convince them of, obviously they will be helpful, and try to show them on the contrary how believing in evolution is coherent with believing in science, which they do as a rule for other domains.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they're not skeptical of the germ theory of disease, for example.
No, so that's for instance, one of my students was working on GMOs, and in France that is extremely widespread and even more forceful than in the US, resistance against GMOs. And the way he was doing it was to tell people, well, look, on the whole, you agree with science and you believe in, when there's a scientific consensus, you should go along with it. And most people believe that's true for climate change, fortunately. And then he's just pointing out to people, well, actually, that's what we have for GMOs. There's a complete scientific consensus that they're completely fine and harmless, et cetera, and beneficial in many ways. And it does work. So, not everybody comes from, completely hating them to loving them, but it works quite well.
What do you think is the motive behind the GMO skeptics?
Yeah, I kind of wish I knew. I guess part of it is it's really perceived as this intrusion into something we eat. So we have this kind of disgust mechanisms, contamination mechanisms that make us extremely wary of ingesting anything that is kind of tainted in some way. and it's seen as tainting our food, as putting genes that are artificial and bad in our food. Um, and I think that's part of it. So obviously there's widespread, like very few people have any idea what GMOs actually are, or the fact that
Right.
people, like all the food we eat is genetically modified in a more natural way, but still. So I think that's part of it. But I'm still kind of puzzled by how strong it is, like how strong the reaction against. And broadly, anything that touches food is a domain in which people will intuitively apply a very strong principle of precaution.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. When you go to a Whole Foods here in America, which is one of the larger sort of health food chains, it's kind of a spiritual experience. I mean, people pay like double, in some cases even more, for food that they feel is, more pure, organic. It's kind of a spiritual thing. It's almost a religion in a way for atheists. And if you think about religions, most of them have rules about diet and food. So it may be tapping a very ancient impulse.
Yes, because it's something that clearly matters to everyone, that you can display very often, because you have meals all the time. So every time you have an opportunity to check what people are eating, to show that you're eating the right things. So it's just a great medium for displaying your beliefs.
In America, anyway, there's a second element, and that's economic. That is, GMOs are seen as a manipulative tool of capitalists. In this case, Monsanto, is always lumped with, you almost never hear a sentence with GMO in it without Monsanto and evil also in the sentence.
Yeah, but obviously, organic food is also a big business in many ways, and people don't seem to be picking up on that at all.
Right.
So it doesn't help for Monsanto. The kind of the reputation it has for good and bad reasons doesn't help.
Yeah.
But the fact that people are so blind to the same criticism in one case suggests that it's not really maybe what's driving the more kind of intuitive repulsion towards GMOs and attraction towards food that is, as you were saying, kind of pristine and clean and natural.
Right. It's like, and the anti-vaxxers seem to be equal opportunity offenders on the left and right. Liberals don't trust big pharma because they're out to make money, and conservatives don't trust big government telling us what I'm going to do with my children.
But more broadly, then again, it's a case in which it's also largely specific to vaccination. So most people have no problem with chemotherapy, even though you could make exactly the same arguments. And indeed, there has been resistance against vaccinations from the very beginning in England, when the first kind of enforced inoculation and vaccination movements. So it's a deeply counterintuitive therapy. Like, it's the most efficient therapy, with penicillin. And the fact, the idea of injecting what people think is a disease, which is not really, but what people think is a disease, into a healthy baby in a way that is mildly painful, like, it's really unlucky that the best thing we have is the most counterintuitive. Like, it's just bad luck.
Right.
Whereas penicillin is less of a problem. There's no widespread resistance to antibiotic. On the contrary, the problem is that people take too many antibiotics. Like in France, it's a big problem that people they really want antibiotics whenever they have a cold, which is really bad. So there really is something specific to vaccination, even though obviously antibiotics are also made by big companies, et cetera. There's something about vaccination that makes it that people don't like it.
Yeah, there's some counties in, I think, state of Washington that have said, you are free to not vaccinate your kids if you want, but you can't take them to any public parks, libraries, public schools, and so on.
Fair enough, yeah.
Yeah, because the freedom for me to swing my arm ends at your nose.
It's hard to enforce then, possibly. I mean, in schools you can enforce it, but otherwise it just becomes hard to enforce.
Yeah. Yeah, and that leads us to conspiracy theories, which are really difficult for skeptics to deal with because enough of them are real. That
exactly.
there's a good reason to be skeptical of governments and big organizations, because they do lie to their citizens. They do cheat their customers. It happens just enough that it's good to be kind of skeptical and conspiratorial.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So you can't be dismissive out of hand. One of the points I want to make in that respect, and is that, as I was saying earlier, it's a case in which most of the beliefs in conspiracy theories are extremely reflective. So, for instance, if you're in Pakistan and you believe the ISI, like the equivalent of the CIA, is evil and powerful. It's a very intuitive feeling, and you shut up because they're going to kill you if you say it too loudly. Whereas in the US, people say, the CIA is behind 9/11 and they're evil and they're powerful and they can kill whoever they want. And yet they let me say that they're evil and powerful and they're behind
Right.
9/11.
Yeah.
There's this guy, Jonathan Kay, who wrote a book about
Yeah, I know
truthers.
Jonathan. Yeah, it's a great book.
And it's a fantastic book. And he points out there are a few people who are coherent and that they're hiding in in a cave from the government because they believe that the government did that. And if you actually believe, and it's not actually believe because most truthers are, they're very convinced that it's true. But if you intuitively believe that the government is doing that, then that's what you should be doing. And so the other example I really like that I take in the book is that of the Pizzagate. So when high-level Democrats were accused of abusing small children in the basement of a pizzeria in Washington D.C., there's this one guy who took his assault weapon and who went to the restaurant and said, show me the basement and free the children. And he was right in that if he believed that children were being abused and that the police was corrupt and wasn't doing anything, what he was doing was rational and moral.
Right.
And the millions of people who were saying that is true and who were doing nothing, or who were leaving 1-star review of the restaurant, saying, I went there with my kids, but people were looking at them, suspiciously, which is like, how would you go to your kids to a place where you suspect kids are being abused? I mean, who in their right mind would do that? These people believed only reflectively. So in a way, it's reassuring when you see the numbers. 5 million of Americans believe in Pizzagate. In a way, it's true and it's worrying and it's not a good thing. On the other hand, they don't believe it intuitively at all. So it's less bad than it might seem.
Right. So like when Alex Jones proffered his false flag operation for the Sandy Hook school shooting, that just sounded crazy. But if you look at some of the CIA activity in the 1950s and 60s, where we were manipulating other governments, we were participating in the assassination of dictators who we didn't like. We like the fascist dictators more than the communist dictators because they're more likely to come across and helpful to American interests, and so on and so forth. Then I came across that Operation Northwoods, which didn't come out until 1997 with the release of some JFK assassination paperwork that Kennedy's administration presented to him, his chief of staffs of the military, this idea of setting up false flag operations in Cuba as a pretext to go to war with Cuba or to kill Castro. And there were lots of attempts to assassinate Castro and so on. So when you read this, now Kennedy turned these down. One of them was like, we're going to dress up a U.S. plane to look like a Russian MiG. We'll fly it over the Miami airport, and then we'll go down and invade Cuba. And Kennedy's like, this is insane. We can't do this. But the fact that government officials were even thinking about and presented it as a written document, like, here's some ideas. Whoa, okay, so it's not completely crazy to think that the government does false flag operations.
No, that's the problem. So I mean, as long as governments aren't entirely trustworthy, there'll be conspiracy theories. I mean, maybe even if they are entirely trustworthy, there'll be conspiracy theories. And on the whole, it's you kind of have to worry. Like, I'm sure in Germany in Nazi Germany there are no conspiracy theories people were expressing because they were too afraid for their lives. And the fact that people can express crazy conspiracy theories, or that the most crazy ones maybe is probably a good thing. So obviously there's a trade-off, and in the case of Sandy Hook, it became extremely deleterious for a bunch of reasons. But it's on the whole, the fact that people express conspiracy theories is a sign that the society is relatively healthy. But still, like, I believe that I don't think there's any good data on this. My intuition is that you have fewer conspiracy theories in Norway than in the US, because on the whole, the government is just less corrupt, less open to bribery in many ways, less open to conflicts of interest. That it's also a smaller country. People know the politicians better, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you see governments trying to blame the public, and obviously the public is to blame to some extent for conspiracy theories, I think it's on them. Like, they have to be better, and then it's not going to solve the problem completely, but it will help.
And when I was researching my course on conspiracies, I was reading about Stalin, who was famously paranoid and didn't trust anybody. Why did he fall for Hitler and not see Hitler was about to invade? And there's an interesting backstory there that the British were sending him through back channels signals that, we think the Germans are going to invade. They're piling up troops on the border here. They have tanks over there and so on. And he ended up concluding, and his intelligence officers got him this information. He said, that's a false flag. They're trying to trick us into thinking that the Germans are going to invade so that we invade first and so on. And so you kind of see that mind spinning, and boy.
Yeah. There's another great example is in North Korea. People are extremely wary of any form of propaganda for good reasons, because that's the only information they get is essentially government propaganda. So they know not to trust anything. But to some extent, it sort of backfires because increasingly the South Koreans have been trying to get some materials across to North Korea to show them that that things are actually great outside of North Korea, that things are in the way the government wants them to believe they are. And they don't believe that either. So, for instance, there's this. So sometimes they would just give them, like at the time, like USB sticks, things like Friends, or the South Korean equivalent of Friends, kind of this kind of series, and they would see these normal people living in a big apartment with cars and grocery stores, full of food, and they think that this is impossible. It's just impossible that such a thing is true. It has to be propaganda by South Korea to try to tell us, to get us to get there. Like they couldn't believe, they're becoming like overly skeptical the way kind of Stalin was you were describing, instead of just accepting everything.
There aren't many dictatorships like that around anymore, but certainly North Korea is the most prominent one. I wonder to what extent the citizens really believe, say, that Kim Jong-un is a supernatural deity type character. Or any of the propaganda they say, or when his father died, there's those films of people famously, crying for days on end. And does the regime really believe that those people believe that those are real tears? So
that's a good point, and I think we can conclusively say that no, because if they believe that people believe, they wouldn't have to have this fantastic repression apparatus. They think, people believe we're great. We don't have to send them and their whole family to camp every time they don't cry at the right moment.
Right.
So the very fact that they keep doing this, it shows that they don't believe the people, and the people don't believe them either. No one believes anything.
That's amazing.
But that's which is obviously vastly dysfunctional, and it doesn't work very well as a country. But also we see most of the data we get is from refugees who are not a good sample, because they're going to clearly you don't expect them to believe in the regime. That's why they left. But they tend to say that even the people who stayed obviously don't believe most of the things that are said. But as I was saying, it doesn't mean that they know the truth, because they have no way of knowing the truth. They have no access to. Things are changing a bit now with the internet, but they have no way of knowing the truth. And so, as much as they don't believe what the regime is saying, they also don't think that America is great or that South Korea is doing fantastically well, because they have no reason to believe that. Indeed, when the history they have access to, the US was not great, and South Korea was doing less good than North Korea. So that they know, and they know their parents or their grandparents knew that, and because they have been shuttered from the rest of the world since, that's kind of what they keep believing, because they have no reason to believe otherwise. But it doesn't mean they believe the lies that the regime is saying now. I mean, if you have a widespread famine, you're not going to believe that things are plentiful. I mean, it's just not possible.
It's such a crazy idea that here you get these people sobbing in the streets. They don't believe it. They're fake tears. The regime doesn't believe the fake tears. No one believes any of it, but they all have to go along with the system, I guess, to keep it afloat.
Yes, I mean, it's fantastically useful, because and the higher you put the bar, the easier it will be for you to detect people who are not willing to get along. So, because it's you really have to show your support in such forceful ways. Anybody who is actually, wavering a little bit will be immediately spotted and sent to camp, essentially. And so to a camp, like not to camp he was central to a camp. And so it is useful for the regime, even though they know that people don't believe. It is still tremendously useful for them to do that, and also the sheer, and as you were saying, stopping people from realizing other people hate the regime as much as they do, and just inundating all the airwaves, all the channels of communication with their own message. It just stops other people from saying anything else.
Any idea what it would take to end the madness in North Korea?
No, that's just like really beyond my pay grade.
I don't know what to do about it either. I mean, at
it's
least
going to be hard
Trump's
because
been
now
hammered. Trump's been hammered for going over there to talk to the guy, but no one's done any better before him.
no, it's hard, and things are getting more complicated because the ties with South Korea are declining as people who have common families are dying, and as the wealth gap is increasing, it becomes increasingly less likely that South Korea will move for a reconciliation because, and even like when West Germany integrated East Germany. It was hard and they suffered economically a lot. And the gap between East and West Germany was vastly less important than the gap is between North Korea and South Korea is now. So no one wants, in a way, no one has I mean, the South Korea sort of want North Korea to go free, but they also have, incentives not to. And clearly the Chinese don't want anything to change because they don't have a flood of refugees to go from North Korea either. So it's bad to be a North Korean. Yeah, it's not clear who has an incentive for things really to change.
Yeah, my wife's from Cologne, Germany, in Western Germany, and she said after the unification, some of the West Germans were grumbling a little bit because they had to pay a tax to help the East Germans because they were so poor. And this still continues to this day, apparently. And there's still
there's a transfer. There's still, I mean, even I don't know if it's an official tax, but clearly there's a wealth transfer between the West that is richer, and which is fine. But yeah, I mean, obviously the problem with North Korea would be like a different order of magnitude.
Yeah, I've seen those graphs of, they started off the same economically per capita GDP in like 1972 or whatever. And then, this diverges like that to the point where I think the average South Korean makes like $24,000 a year. And in North Korea, it's like $1,400 a year. It's just,
or something.
Yeah, it's just nothing. And you can see the difference in height. They're like 3 inches shorter in North Korea. And the most dramatic one of all is the picture from space.
Yes,
with it's just dark. But obviously they don't see those graphs in North Korea.
No, they don't see. No, but they see them. So they don't see how well the South Koreans are doing, but they know they're doing poorly. They're also not doing. They're doing a bit less well than they were before, but they're not. I mean, then again, it's funny because we assume now that there's this constant progress and growth and everything. But until then, it wasn't clear for if you're North Korean in 1956 or something. It's not clear that things are going to become amazingly, you're going to become amazingly rich. So the fact that things are staying the way they've always been for them, and they were crap under the Japanese, and they've been crap for a while. It's less bad from the outside. It looks awful because you compare them to South Korea or to other countries or even to China. But for them, if they compare themselves to what happened before, it's bad, but it's less horrible than it looks.
If political propaganda and even campaign advertising and so forth doesn't work very well, if at all, why do politicians amass these, multi-million-dollar war chests, as they're called? They just announced last week all the Democratic candidates and tens of millions of dollars, and they're going to start spending it. Trump just announced he's going to run a Super Bowl ad, for like $10 million or something. Yeah. So if it doesn't work, why do they do it?
So it doesn't work in that the effects are very, very, very small, if there are any effects. So it depends on the elections. Like in primaries, it works a little bit better because people have fewer preconceived notions because they're all Democrats or all Republicans. And so the fact that they work a little bit, so out of 100,000 people who will see the ad, maybe will convince a handful, but that might be enough. And also that may be the only thing you have. And so you have a lot of people wanting to to give you money. And then you have to do something with it. And you can also imagine that there is prestige. So I think it's possible that the strategy of spending so much on presidential elections compared to other elections is probably somewhat misguided. But I can see how for donors and for candidates, there is a prestige attached with that particular election, such that you want to be seen as donating money to the presidential candidate rather than to the guy who is running in the 3rd District of Arkansas.
Or maybe the amassing of the millions itself is a signal. I'm a player. Whether the money does anything or not, it's a signal that I should be taken seriously.
Yes, clearly someone like Bloomberg has been using that. Like if I'm going to spend that much money, it's a way of showing that they're serious. But then again, it's not clear how even that convinces people beyond the Beltway or beyond really kind of political people who follow politics quite closely.
Yeah.
And indeed, you can see like with Bloomberg, it's kind of an interesting example because even though in primaries ads work a little bit better than in or kind of political campaigns in general work a bit better than in general elections. Even Bloomberg, and so there was Bloomberg and Strayer. I think that they spent about the same amount of money, and they're both polling at like 3% and 5% respectively. And Bloomberg is doing I think maybe twice as well as Strayer. And I think it's mostly because of name recognition, because he was already famous, whereas Strayer wasn't. And so it's not clear that their money made that much of a difference. Maybe they bought them like 1 percentage point in an election that is supposedly easier to influence.
Right.
So it's not much.
Yeah, Andrew Yang's campaign just announced he raised $16 million in the fourth quarter of 2019. And they made a big deal about this, like, see, our guy is a player.
I mean, but so they do it. But then again, it's not clear whether that has any. So you can see how it might have an impact on other donors,
right?
Because if you think the guy is losing, then you're not going to start, giving him any money. But then again, it's still like, but if the money doesn't make a difference, why should you want to convince donors to give you more money? That's still not going to make a difference,
right? Yeah.
But people want money. That's just.
Well, the idea seems to be that without the money, I can't run a campaign because I got to pay people and I got to take out ads and so on.
You need some money. Clearly, you need some money. And you can see how if you're not fighting to have a lot of money, then you end up having none because no one believes you can actually get it.
Right.
And so even if you might not need all that money, and clearly the 100 million of Bloomberg have been, I think, mostly wasted. Even if you don't need that, as you were saying, you might need to stay in, to show that you have a lot of it, to stay in the horse race, to have at least the minimum you need to, as you were saying, to have staff.
Right. Let's talk about cults for a minute. It's another big topic for skeptics, for Skeptic Magazine. Why do people join cults? I'm fond of saying no one's ever joined a cult in the history of the world. They join a group that they think is great or helpful or going to benefit them or save society or whatever.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's essentially it. And so first of all, as we were saying earlier, the conviction rate is, the rate at which people are persuaded by this kind of proselytizing is extremely low, and that's kind of well recorded for all, even the most successful new sects like the Mormons or the new religions like the Mormons or the people who follow Reverend Moon. Most people who are contacted, or even most people who start on that path, end up not going the whole way.
Yeah,
and those who do seem to be doing fine. Like as a rule, they find a group that seems to fit with their frame of mind, with their objectives, with the way they want to live their lives. Obviously, you have the odd exception, but as a rule, it's just fine.
Yeah, I like the way you handled it in the book. That first, not that many people do join cults or new religious movements or whatever, and those that do, most of them benefit from it. Yeah. We only hear about the ones that end up getting physically or sexually or financially abused or taken advantage of, and that makes the news. So it seems like, look, these cults are crazy, they're all crazy, and anyone that joins them is crazy because look what happens. But in fact, it's a kind of a selection bias.
Yes, there's a huge sampling bias, yes. And indeed, most people who are happy doing their thing, they won't, you won't hear about them because it's not really newsworthy. When somebody joins a cult and they're happy about it, it's like, well, okay.
Yeah, right. Good luck with that. Yeah. In fact, the stuff that's come out in the last few years about Scientology since the Going Clear documentary film came out and others, Leah Remini has a series on A&E about the abuses of the church. They never had tens of millions of followers, like they said. It's probably less than 100,000 worldwide, but they have a lot of property investment. So they financially they're well off, and they can produce these massive events that look massive anyway, and commercials and so on. It looks like it's a huge thing, but it really isn't.
No, and so I don't know enough about Scientology in particular, but I would guess that most of the people who joined actually, at least at the beginning, found something for them, and then obviously it can still drag you along a path in which it's kind of difficult to turn back. So that can be a bit of a problem, but at least initially, it's not coercive in the vast majority of cases.
Yeah, I once had the opportunity to meet Isaac Hayes. I had a Thanksgiving dinner with him, and through a friend of mine who knew him. Isaac Hayes was the Grammy Award-winning singer, and he was chef on South Park, and anyway, he had a pretty successful career, at least in America. And he when I met him, he had just become a sort of prominent Scientologist. So I said, "What Why?
Yeah.
And he said, they helped me. I had lost all my money. I was, alcohol, drugs, the whole kind of typical musician thing, I guess. And he said, they got me out of it. My life has turned around. My career has turned around. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you say to that? Nothing. It's like, okay, I get that. And I think for a lot of people, religion is the same thing. I like it. It feels good, makes me feel good, helps me.
Yeah, you enjoy. Mostly it's what people do rather than what they believe in these cases. And you like being around other religious beliefs who share other religious people who share your moral values. Going to church is nice. It's a social thing. Why not? I mean, then again, the whole kind of nefarious brainwashing thing is just so not at all what's happening. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't issues and there aren't abuses and at the margin, but that's not the rule.
Yeah. Oh, I love that section in your book about brainwashing. Based on the 23 soldiers or 33 soldiers, whatever it was, out of the thousands and thousands of soldiers.
Yeah, of the hundreds.
Again, a selection bias there that never was really even true for even those 33.
Even those who left. So it was people who had been made prisoners of war after the war in Korea. So Americans who had been made prisoners by the Koreans and the Chinese, really. And so a few of them, so they were kind of tortured and supposedly brainwashed. And a few of them did go to China. But the reason they went to China is that they had not been sufficiently defiant towards the Chinese when they were being tortured by them. And so they were afraid that, or maybe some of them kind of cooperated with them to some extent. And so they were afraid that they would be punished going back to the US. And so indeed, and some of them had been court-martialed going back to the US. So they had a choice between either being fitted as a new convert in China and everything would be great, or being potentially court-martialed or sent to jail in the US. So it's like, but again, you don't need brainwashing to explain that choice. And most of them actually recounted even that and tried to flee China after that. So the success rate was positively 0 out of, then again, I think there was 2,300 POWs.
Yeah.
So it was really, like, you can't imagine something as overblown as that.
Yeah, again, back to conspiracy theories, the CIA had that program on brainwashing and then and giving people drugs, hallucinogens, and all that stuff that came out. Yeah, they tried everything. And it's like, wait, our government was doing that? What?
Yeah. And then it's harder to confront conspiracy theories when you know about actual conspiracies. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they had Operation Stargate. I don't know if you know about this, but this was the feared psychic gap with the Russians and Chinese that we allegedly had, that they had psychics. So we have to, nourish our psychics and see if this stuff really works. To the point where they actually had experiments in remote viewing. This went on for about 10 years. They, I don't know, $10 million or something. Nothing is a percentage of the federal budget, but still. And they had these remote viewers down in, the basement in these closed rooms with these ping pong balls over their eyes and headphones for silence. And then now try to picture where the missile silos are located, or the missing soldier, where the Russian submarine is, and so on. And there's tons of documentation on this stuff. They claim they got enough hits to justify it, but statistically speaking, I don't think that it was really there.
But I think it does highlight one of the criteria that people can use to tell real conspiracies from the fake ones is the size of it. So in most of these cases, it's actually a relatively small group of people who is involved. Right. You have like one person, one kind of higher up who is kind of covering that, and then you have a small group of people who is doing that crazy thing. But something like 9/11 or like faking the moon landing would require the coordination of hundreds and thousands of people, and no one can pull that off.
Right.
And it's just like people aren't that good. So I think size. So obviously conspiracies happen, but a conspiracy that involves hundreds of people is never going to stay hidden and secret for long enough. That's right. That's just not possible.
Yeah, I like to say that, the more people that have to be involved, the more elements that have to come together at the exact right time and the perfect time. That's just not how the real world works. Yeah.
It's funny because the same people who rail against, government being so inefficient also believe that it's so good at doing conspiracy theories. Like, well, you can't have it both ways.
Yes. Right, because the 9/11 truthers, they're like, first of all, they're saying, Bush is the most bumbling, fumbling, idiot president we've ever had, but he pulled off the most sophisticated conspiracy in
It was
history.
within that one respect.
Yeah. It's too funny. I don't know if you ever read John Ronson's book, The Men Who Stare at Goats.
That
It's
was
just,
brilliant.
again, it's just, this sort of psychic spy thing. And it's like, but really, it's just like they put one guy in charge of it. You could just picture some bureaucrat going, okay, maybe the Russians are doing this. All right, you go try this. And, here's a couple $1,000,000, which is nothing out of the budget. And, it's really not that big a deal.
Yeah, no, completely, yeah. There's something else I wanted to...
On cults or... Well, on people joining groups, a question I have is, why would someone join ISIS? Particularly like some, youngster, teenager, early 20s in Ohio or somewhere, just going, yep, I'm going to go to Afghanistan, Iraq or whatever, and join this group.
I don't know. I mean, I guess somehow they think their prospects are going to be better there. Like they'll be more of a man. They'll be more recognized. They'll have a higher status within that group. Maybe more access to girls. Really, I think it's mostly, there are a few females who enroll, but it is mostly males. And so what we have to think of it not in terms of, obviously they won't have a better material life necessarily, but I think they think their status will improve, that they will have a higher status within ISIS that they have in their own community. So it would be people who I guess they don't think they have the status they deserve. They think they maybe smarter than they are, or that other people think they are, or that they're stronger or whatever. And they see that, I guess, as a way of gaining the status they think they deserve. And obviously it's probably misguided.
Yeah.
I guess it has, but it's not something I'm an expert on at all, but that would be from my little reading of the would be my guess.
I think so. I think that's right. More the social aspects. Again, back to your book, it's, so much of what we do in communications is social, what other people think of us, reputation management, that sort of thing. And back to that question of to what extent do people really believe something? When I was reading your book, I was thinking about that statistic that came out during the Obama administration about, this was when the Me Too movement was first really taking off, that, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted on college campuses. And this was based on, one study on 2 campuses in which the question was phrased in a way like, have you ever been inappropriately touched or touched when you didn't give consent or something like that. And so the Obama administration famously sent out this Dear Colleague letter saying, we got to get a handle on this crisis. This is an epidemic of sexual assault sweeping, American campuses. And, then that meme kind of got started, 20% or in some cases 25% of young women will be assaulted in their 4 years at a college campus. If you really believe that, would you send your daughter to college?
Yeah, no, presumably you wouldn't. Yeah.
So
and
they
that didn't
can't
stop
really
people at all.
Yeah, it didn't. No. So what is it people are really believing and thinking, or is it sort of signaling there is a real problem? Sexual assault is a real problem. We want to do something about it, and therefore
I think that's the way of saying that, because in a way that the numbers hide how bad things are. So if you get sexually assaulted, it can be completely, obviously, devastate your life and be extremely hard for the person who has been affected, and there are people who surround them. And so if you say, well, okay, but it's just 5%, it looks as if you're saying, well, it doesn't really matter. So I think it's the perception. Indeed, you could do an experiment in which you ask people what. You have someone say, well, I think there is X and X percent of women being, or girls, or young women being assaulted on college campuses, and do you think that person thinks it's a big deal or not? And they're not actually saying anything about whether it's a big deal or not. They're just stating a percentage, and obviously, people who claim it's a higher percentage would be perceived as thinking it's a more of a problem. So that's a way of communicating that you think it's a big problem, and it's unfortunate in a way. But it's not clear that it's that unfortunate, in that as long as the numbers aren't used for anything specific, any specific policy, as long as they're just used as a way of highlighting the problem, it doesn't have to be a big issue. But yes, then if you start basing policies on those specific numbers that are misleading and that are popular partly because they allow people to express their opinion, then you're into trouble. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Hugo, we've been going almost 2 hours. Let's kind of wrap up back to where we started with, are we living in a post-truth world, or is there something of a selection bias because it's Trump and and social media? It just seems like all the lies are highlighted so much. It feels intuitively like it's worse than it's ever been. But what are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, in many ways, it's better than it's ever been in that people are more informed than they were. So if you look, for instance, at so people, decry polarization in the U.S., but what's happening to a large extent is that people are more informed about politics than they used to be. They're still not very well informed, but people are more informed than they used to be. And because of that, they also tend to be more consistent in their point of view. So Democrats will be more consistently Democrats in their opinions, and vice versa for Republicans. So it looks as if people are polarizing, but in fact they don't have more extreme opinions. They just have actually more opinions and more kind of informed opinions. So on the whole, I think people have more information than they had before. But ironically, we also have more information about all the bad stuff that's going on, including all the fake news, etc. So even though, for instance, fake news, it's a very marginal phenomenon. Only a few percent of Twitter or Facebook users actually see fake news or spread fake news. It doesn't even affect those who see them. But it's very easy to. But many people hear about fake news,
right?
And so I think that, and in a way, it's a good thing because it is a phenomenon and people hear about it. So it's not a complete form of misinformation. But it's misleading. And on the whole, I think the informational environment is improving slowly and not as much as we'd like it to be. But I think I actually think things are better than they used to.
Are you
marginally?
Marginally, yes. Are you encouraged about with the rise of the fact checking sites and really the idea like fact checking? We got to fact check.
Yes, I mean, obviously that's something that journalists have been doing since the dawn of the profession, and historians to some extent.
Yeah.
But the fact that there is more of a demand for that kind of services is obviously a good thing, and reflects the fact that some people really want to have accurate opinions and care about the truth, and most people do to some extent. So it's not, most people, if you show them that a fake news is fake, they will actually say, well, actually, okay, I've changed my mind. It's not going to change their underlying opinion.
Right.
So, there have been studies, for instance, showing that people who believe fake news that support Trump, you can get them to accept that it's actually fake news, but it's not going to lower their support for Trump because they weren't supporting Trump because they believe the fake news. They were believing the fake news because they supported Trump.
Right.
So in a way, the good thing is that it's easier, you can take that out, but the bad thing is that it's not doing that much either way.
I think that's right. My conservative friends that I have, they don't believe Trump, most of his bullshit, and they don't even necessarily like him. But it's like, well, I'm a Republican, and he's my guy. So, I got to hold my nose and pull the handle for him. But also there's an element of, because he's sticking it to the far left, he's sticking it to the political correct, the elites and Hollywood and all that stuff. There's an element of that as well. So again, that's more of the social aspects rather than analytical political positions or something like that.
Yes, and also just sheer self-interest. Like if Republicans tend to be wealthier than Democrats. I mean, obviously there are many wealthy Democrats, but on the rule, as a rule,
yeah. And
he just cut taxes for wealthy people. So it's not pure self-interest. Political scientists know very well that it's not purely just your wallet speaking. But it's also doing something, it's not completely rational.
My Christian friends who I ask, how can you support Trump? He's like the least Christian person in the history of the United States presidency, not to mention his personal behavior. I mean, come on, how can you, if Obama had 3 affairs and paid off a Playboy, whatever. Yeah. And their answer was, he's going to get us the judges we want to overturn Roe v. Wade. We don't care what he does personally. It's like, okay.
And in many ways, I mean, I disagree with them, vehemently, but it makes sense. And most of the evangelical support for him is, I'm sure I hope in a way most of evangelicals hate him personally and just think he's awful. But he is indeed doing what a typical Republican would do, or even what a maybe even more to the right Republican would do. So yeah, I mean, it's sensible from their point of view.
Yep. Well, Hugo, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. The book is Not Born Yesterday: The
Well, thank you so
science
much,
of
Michael.
who we trust and what we believe. Again, I really think it's an important book, not just publicly like this for these super interesting topics, but in your own science of cognitive science. I think it's a game changer. I think it's important we get past this idea that humans are just naturally gullible and we fall for everything. That was never a good meme. So congratulations on making that happen.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. It was a pleasure to be on the show.